perspective when you land.
So
Yes, I guess
good
so.
evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight to our major fall lecture in Jewish Studies here on campus. I'm Julie Mell from the History Department, and before my colleague Hans Kellner from the English Department introduces our speaker, I'd like to say a few words of thanks to our co-sponsors, the Honors Program and the Parks Program here at NC State, as well as the North Carolina Jewish Studies Seminar, which is a joint effort of Duke, UNC, NC State, and Wake Forest. I'd also like to let you know about our next two upcoming events. On January 31st, we will have, in commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, a talk and a performance of formerly lost partisan songs by two University of Toronto professors. So that will be in the evening. The time and place will be confirmed in January, but the information will be is up on the website already. And in February 7th, probably in this room, probably at this time, David Nierenberg will be speaking on anti-Judaism, past and present. His book entitled Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, as well as other works like Communities of Violence, have received a lot of attention recently, and this will be a joint a sponsored lecture by the Triangle Medieval Studies, Duke Jewish Studies, and NC State Jewish Studies. Thanks. I will, two other announcements about tonight. I'll be sending around email sign up if you would like to get information about those events, as well as other ones that will be happening in the spring. And there is a handout from our speaker, which most of you have had. There were some by the doors. For those of you who are coming in, can grab a handout on your way in back there. Okay, I'll turn it over to you.
It's my pleasure tonight to introduce philosopher Raphael Lang, Professor Emeritus at SUNY Albany, where he also served as Director of the Center of Humanities. Professor Lang has a BA from Yale University, not far from his native city of Norwich, Connecticut. Norwich, Connecticut? Yes, right. And a PhD from Columbia, and has also taught at a number of institutions, including Trinity College, Wesleyan University, and the University of Colorado. He's received fellowships from the American Council of Learned Society, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Philosophical Association, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the Hebrew University. To recount his honors, as I've just done a little, would leave him no time to speak. One of his achievements in 1977, he organized and ran an NEH Summer Institute, 6 weeks, on the concept of style in Boulder, Colorado. And I have to add a personal note. My wife and I were participants in that memorable event. And like many others, we were awakened to possibilities that would redirect our careers. So we thank you for that. The English philosopher Robert Collingwood once noted that pre-Socratic philosophers asked three basic questions. First, what's the world made of? Second, how do we know things? And third, how should we lead our lives? Raphael Lang has spent most of his career working on the latter two questions, and he concludes that we know things by representing them, usually in the form of writing, and that we could best lead our lives by careful examination of the representations we make. So with alarming energy, Lang has written book after book on the most complex and challenging philosophical subjects. His aesthetic interest as a philosopher led him to analyze the role of writing and style in philosophy itself, in Philosophy and the Art of Writing, and The Anatomy of Philosophical Style, Literary Philosophy and Philosophy of Literature. These works were the logical successors to his earlier book, Writing and the Moral Self. Above all, Lang has studied the representations of the Holocaust, the point where the aesthetic and the ethical interests intersect and sometimes collide. He surveys the possibility of Holocaust misrepresentation in his book Holocaust Representation, Art Within the Limits of History and Ethics, and in post-Holocaust interpretation, misinterpretation, and the claims of history. I cite these titles only to give you the idea of the other books he has written on this subject. Lang has recently written a study of perhaps the most celebrated and enigmatic Holocaust survivor. Primo Levi, The Matter of a Life, has been described as brilliantly nuanced, strikingly original, and wise and deeply felt, as by 3 different people. And it tackles the tough questions, Levi's suicide and his Jewishness. And just as Lang has tackled Levi's tough questions, so has he tackled other difficult philosophical questions of the 20th century, such as Martin Heidegger's silence about his Nazi past, in the book Heidegger's Silence. Lang's ambition shows in his choice of topics. The title of Lang's forthcoming book, Genocide, the Act as Idea, is meant to recall the title of what is perhaps his most discussed work, Act and Idea in the Nazi Genocide. In that book, and here I will quote, Lang wrote, quote, "When Cain killed Abel, murder became a new element of consciousness, a then constant expectation which put its mark on individual experience and social institutions alike. Analogously, the prospect of genocide is now also inevitable and common. There's no way of avoiding it, and the variations of its past history include everyone, all of humanity in its future." End of quotation. Tonight's lecture is titled Unsung Hero, Raphael Lemkin, and the Concept of Genocide, Vera Lang.
Thanks very much, Hans Kellner, and I'm grateful to you for coming out on this evening. I don't mean to interfere with your anxiety about the lecture, about the election tomorrow, and I mean, Hans has already suggested some of the anxieties which have driven my writing and talking, and I'll be speaking about one of those sources tonight in the tracing the history and the content of the idea or concept of genocide, tracing it mainly to its coiner, to its, in a way, the person who invented it or discovered it, certainly the one who articulated it. And there's a particular relevance, it seems to me, a two-sided relevance in speaking about genocide in this fashion this evening. The first, of course, is that there is the question which many of us are asking: what happens on November 9th, the day after the election? Well, that November 9th marks the anniversary of Kristallnacht in Germany and Austria, the night of the so-called broken glass, when the intent or design of Nazi Germany in relation to the Jews and the prospect of genocide became quite clear and publicly announced to the world by the destruction of synagogues across Germany and Austria, of businesses, the title Broken Glass, Kristall, the idea of the broken glass from the store windows which were shattered in one evening and day, going over to November 10th in 1938, really done publicly and covered by the newspapers of the world, because it was Even at that time, Hitler had been in power for 5 years, but this was an extraordinary moment in world history. Now, the question of what impact it had, that's another matter, and perhaps you'll yourselves look into that at some point, the question of what was done on the basis of that. And certainly for the populace of Germany within the country, it had an impact, and the question of what other consequences it might have had that it didn't have remained to be told and retold. The second point I want to make is relates to specifically to Durham, to North Carolina, because the man about whom I'll be speaking, Raphael Lemkin, who was a refugee from Poland, found refuge in Durham, North Carolina. I mean, it's quite a story in its own right. Lemkin was a lawyer in Poland, and I'll be speaking a bit about his life subsequently. He was a lawyer in Poland who was advanced very rapidly in his career and wrote a good deal. One of the books that he collaborated on, he collaborated with a professor of law of Duke University Law School. And after the Nazi invasion of Poland, in which Lemkin himself lost many members of his family, Lemkin himself made the effort to escape. But of course, the escape then was quite difficult. One needed visas to go, certainly to come to the United States. This Professor McDermott of the Duke Law School in Durham enabled, through the embassy and through diplomatic avenues, he was able to obtain a visa for Lemkin. And Lemkin arrived in the United States in 1941 in Durham. He was appointed a visiting professor of law. It wasn't a lasting appointment, but it enabled him to get out of Poland, to reach the safety of the United States, and to do the very important work which I'll be talking about and which I hope to call your attention to. I mentioned in the title of my talk, Unsung Hero, Raphael Lemkin, and the idea of genocide. That unsung hero is important because I would guess that for many of you in the audience, this may be the first time you hear the name. I don't mean to assume that or presume on it, but he is a figure who has disappeared in history generally, and the very idea of genocide has become such a commonplace. The term itself, Lemkin coined the word, and I'll be speaking a bit about that. Lemkin coined the word itself. So the word, which is now so commonplace in English, was coined by him, and the concept too is his. I mean, it's not, again, as I'll be suggesting, that the phenomenon or the occurrence of genocide, he didn't invent that, alas. I mean, that wasn't, that had occurred, and he himself traced the history of genocides before the Nazi genocide against the Jews. But he did articulate the concept in a way that it hadn't been defined and presented before, and it's that which I'll be speaking about in relation to Lemkin's own life and his role as what I'm calling the unsung hero. So, the enormity of the Holocaust makes it awkward, even unseemly, to speak about the roles of single individuals in it. Even the Holocaust's most notorious perpetrators appear as shadows when compared to the scale of the event itself that they first imagined and then implemented. The sheer expanse of the Holocaust committed before the eyes of a European populace of hundreds of millions, initiated by a country known for its rich culture, outweighs individual references. Still more specifically, the act committed in the Holocaust was a genocide, the attempt to annihilate one group of people by another group. To be sure, people on all sides can be identified for their individual roles in the Holocaust. Individuals among the Nazis and their collaborators with more immediate responsibility than others for Nazi policies and actions. But even for those individuals, without the masses of passive supporters and indifferent bystanders, the ones directly responsible could not have done what they did. And then too, in contrast to them, were those individuals living among the perpetrators who rose above them, risking their own lives to save others, going beyond what we think of as ordinary moral obligations. The phrase heroic rescuers or righteous among the nations, or less palatably righteous Gentiles, has been applied to non-Jews who, without being threatened themselves, came to the aid of persecuted Jews during the Holocaust, risking and at times losing their own lives. A number of these, approximately 30,000 out of the hundreds of millions of Europeans at the time, a number of these, approximately 30,000, have been recognized individually in Jerusalem's museum and memorial Yad Vashem, but also, and even for them, the sheer magnitude of the Nazi genocide overpowers that nobility. Similarly, no like category has been proposed of righteous or heroic Jews, and also for this there's a reason, since the 6 million dead, however their fate reached them, many of them distant from their Jewish roots, half or quarter Jews who were included, or though others who were fully assimilated culturally, paid with their lives for the pseudo-biological identification forced on them by the Nazis. Pseudo-biological because in Judaism, Jewishness was conceived of as a racial category by the Nazis. The very concept of race, of course, has been under pressure, but at the time it was much taken for granted. On the other hand, that raised the question of the Jews as a race, but it didn't stop the Nazis from defining them as a race. So not heroism on that side either, even among the Jews, however terrible the collective fate they suffered. And this extends even to individual figures who do stand out among those who were persecuted. Abba Kovner, the 20-year-old partisan leader in Vilna, he was 20 years old, which many of the students here, I imagine, are about that same age. One of the few who, as early as 1941, predicted the design of the Holocaust as total extermination. Hanna Senish, not much older than that, the young Hungarian Jewish woman who had escaped to then Palestine and volunteered to parachute back into Hungary as a partisan and was then captured and killed. Certain members of the Jewish councils appointed to govern the ghettos when they were established, the Judenräte, certain members like Adam Chernyakov, the head of the Warsaw Jewish Council, who, when ordered by the Nazis to select ghetto Jews for deportation to the camps, found suicide the only means to remain innocent. Even those and others among the partisan or resistant fighters in the ghettos and camps, however heroic in standard terms, remain lone, small-scale figures when viewed alongside the massive symbol and number of the 6 million, which has become an icon of the Jews who were killed. Well, obviously that number is an approximation, but an approximation that makes the point of what the genocide was. Why then should I be speaking here and now about Raphael Lemkin as a hero related to the Holocaust? Lemkin, who although more than 40 of his family members, including his parents, were murdered in it, he himself survived mainly in the safety of the United States, and whose resistance to the Holocaust came not from arms but from words, not as the leader of a government or even an official, but in effect as a lobbyist. and it is his words that continue to echo now, 70 years after the end of World War II, and almost 60 years after his own death. He died in 1959. Words familiar to us whenever we use the term or think the idea of genocide, even if we rarely think then of the person who first thought the idea and so enables us to do that. It's a harsh irony of history that Lemkin himself, although well known publicly during his lifetime, fell into personal isolation and neglect in the last years of his life, an obscurity that has lasted, and that leads me to refer to him now as an unsung hero. There were clearly external reasons for this neglect, this evolving neglect, beginning with his own personal character, his obsessive character, but also with the common tendency to think of heroism as involving somehow physical violence, physical resistance, and the risks that heroes run above and beyond the call of duty, the standard locution for heroism. Furthermore, the medals for heroism tend to be awarded for accomplishments in the lifetime of a person, not for the bequest a person leaves for future generations. And Lemkin was not a fighter in this sense either. Our inheritance from him, and I say our, as a collective human our, it is our common inheritance, looms even not larger now than it did during his lifetime. The starting point for this side of Lemkin, his originality, and indeed I don't think it's too strong to say his genius, centers in the conceptualization and naming of genocide, the identification of what Lemkin recognized as a distinctive crime and the coining, which he did, of its name. The term genocide itself came to him after a few false starts, after trying out barbarism and vandalism, for example, but then discarding them. In the end, he saw the need for a new word, and to do this, he put together the Greek term ginas, which means group, used to group, and the Latin cide, C-I-D-E, referring to killing, a root familiar in English words already, like in words like homicide or patricide. So he coined the word genocide, which literally then means group killing, group murder. Killing is the strict, a term now so familiar to us that it's easy to forget its relatively recent entry into the language, 1944, and I'll say something about that in a book that Lemkin published in 1944. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, early in World War II, referred to Nazi actions and policy at that time as a crime that had no name. And at the time, it had no name. It was that vacuum, this absence, that Lemkin filled. As a matter of record, the word genocide first appeared in print in a book Lemkin published in the United States in 1944, a book with the prosaic title of Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. That's the title of the book, and it investigates, it analyzes the information then available of what the Germans had done in countries they occupied. In reflecting on that new term, Lemkin emphasized that giving a name to this crime did not mean that the crime had not been committed before being named. In this respect, it was like the discovery and naming of a disease, something like Alzheimer's or tuberculosis, whose effects had been known but was not recognized in itself. Genocide, Lemkin emphasized, was indeed a type of killing, which was familiar, but it differed significantly from other types, from the killing of individuals as individuals, and even from the mass murder of large numbers of people. What genocide pointed at was the murder of groups, as groups, the extinction of groups. And groups, Lemkin insisted, should be recognized as more than only the individuals who make them up. Groups on this understanding have their own identity and thus deserve protection in their own right. Group killing, genocide, may, and in many cases has, also involved the death of individuals. In those instances, genocide involves a double murder of the individuals and of the group. Double murder was a phrase that Lemkin himself used, and it certainly was graphically exemplified in the Nazi policies and actions after 1941. There could hardly be a clearer statement of what Lemkin meant by genocide than that provided by Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, in a speech to SS officers in Poznan, Poland in 1943, when he proclaimed about the Jews, here I'm quoting, "This people must be made to disappear from the earth." The people, the group. Chilling, but it was it was then, and the effort was made to implement that, a statement for which no commentary is needed. It's clear as any statement could be. Lemkin at one time began to write what he thought of as a world history of genocide, although he never completed it, and he found examples there of genocides extending back to Greece and Rome, as well as to the Hebrew Bible and the Christian past. Indeed, he himself had become concerned about the dangers confronting minority groups in the modern state, well before the Nazis' so-called final solution. That was a phrase which will be familiar to you. The Nazis had code words for much of their vocabulary, and the final solution was part of a phrase, the final solution of the Jewish question. And it's a code. Even the code wasn't permitted to be used popularly. And look at the layers of the Nazi language, which is an intriguing phenomenon in its own right, as is the language of totalitarianism more generally. I mean, final solution, by itself, it's an innocuous statement, isn't it? Final solution. You have a problem, well, you look for a solution. And if you find a very good solution, that's the final. You finally solved the problem that you have. That's the way in which they presented what in effect was, that was a code word for extermination. And so that's the final solution of the Jewish question in Nazi terms. As a teenager, Lemkin was aware of pogroms directed against the Jewish populace in Eastern Europe, some of them close to where he grew up, and he became aware when he was a university student of the massacre of the Armenians in Turkey in 1917-19. But the systematic extent of the Nazi genocide when it occurred was distinctive, and it gave a special focus to Lemkin's thinking in relation to both the idea and the act of genocide. Before turning to the UN legislation on genocide, of which you have a copy, the so-called Convention on the punishment and prevention of the crime of genocide, let me say something more about Lemkin's life. He was born in 1900 on a farm in eastern Poland, close to the small town of Volkowice, with a population of about 20,000, where his family moved when he was 10. Lemkin studied there in both the Hebrew school, the Cheder, and the local schools, thus early on learning Hebrew and Yiddish in addition to standard Polish, as well as the local dialect that he encountered on the farm. In 1920, he enrolled in the University of Lvov, beginning studies there in philology, but then shifting to law. His interest in languages was lifelong. He would eventually have a reading knowledge of 12 languages and a speaking knowledge of most of them. After he received his degree, his career as a lawyer advanced in Poland rapidly despite the growing challenge of anti-Semitism there. By 1927, he would have been 27 then, he had been appointed a deputy prosecutor in Warsaw's district court, and he also found time to write and publish several books, including one on the Polish Penal Code. That was the one on which he collaborated with the Duke professor of law, McDermott, and also to write a column for a Warsaw Yiddish paper on Jewish and Polish legal issues. Enormous energy was evident even at that time. I mean, in the 1930s, his interest in international law grew to include economic and trade issues, but also with a turn to the legal status of human rights. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, Lemkin was in Warsaw. He quickly saw that the German goal was not only the conquest of Poland, but the systematic murder of its Jewish populace. It's important to keep in mind that Jews were more than 10% of the 30 million Polish population, and that 3 million of the 3.3 million Polish Jews eventually were victims, Nazi victims. I mean, that was one of the largest percentages of extermination during World War, of the Jews during World War. There are a couple of other countries, Lithuania, for example, where it was 95% of the Jewish populace who were killed, but it was a much smaller group that was represented by the Jews in Lithuania. Lemkin understood that his life depended on escaping from Poland, and through his contacts in Europe and the US, again, mainly Professor McDermott at Duke, he was able to reach first Lithuania, then Sweden, and from Sweden, after receiving a visa, to reach the US by way of Moscow and Japan. He arrived in Seattle in April 1941, and soon after that arrived here in Durham, North Carolina. Here began the part of Lemkin's career that in 1948, not very long after that, would culminate in the United Nations Convention on the so-called Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, 7 short years after his migration to the US. During the war years, after his arrival in 1941, Lemkin was active in American legal circles, lecturing to the American Bar Association. He was also appointed to the to the U.S. government's Board of Economic Warfare. Remember, the United States entered World War II in December 1941. And he was involved immediately, picked up because of his experience in Europe and because of his legal expertise. In 1945, he was appointed to the War Crimes Office, where he had a role in planning for the war trials after the war. He was a jurist. The Nuremberg trials, as they've come to be known, held in Nuremberg, Germany, of the major Nazi criminals, and also the trials of Japanese war criminals, which also ensued after the surrender of Japan, later than that of Germany. In 1944, through the Carnegie Endowment, he published his book, Nazi Rule in Occupied Europe, in which he named and outlined the crime of genocide. When the Nuremberg trials of principal Nazi perpetrators began in 1945, Lemkin was there, urging that genocide be included among the charges against the Nazis. It hadn't been codified at that time. Lemkin was urging that it be codified right there at Nuremberg. And it was one of the charges in the indictment of Nazi criminals, although it wasn't included in the findings of guilt that eventuated and which led to the execution of a number of the principal Nazi perpetrators. For the next 3 years, that is from 45 to 48, Lemkin almost single-handedly devoted his efforts to win the UN adoption of legislation directed against genocide. In doing this, he met with officials of almost all the then rather small United Nations, lobbying them for support, buttonholing them in their embassies and at the UN itself. And finally, in December 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations unanimously passed the convention, of which you have copies before you. More about that shortly, but also some further words about Lemkin's life after its passage in 1948. Much of that time was spent on winning ratification. Much of that time after 48 was spent in winning ratification for the genocide legislation among members of the United Nations by then and including new members as the organization, the United Nations itself, grew. It had to be ratified in addition to passage by the General Assembly. It had to be ratified by a minimum of 20 of the countries, ratified by the individual legislatures of those countries. And it's significant here, parenthetical comment, it failed in the United States Senate. The United States Senate did not ratify the UN Convention on Genocide until 1988, 40 years afterwards, and even then with severe reservations that restricted its scope. During the years after 48, Lemkin was recognized by being nominated a number of times for the Nobel Peace Prize, but even that recognition did not help him much in his personal circumstances. He taught briefly after Duke, at Yale Law School, and at Rutgers, but those two were temporary positions, and he had no regular sources of income. In fact, he personally was forced to turn to friends and public organizations for financial help. For various reasons, even people who had been his allies deserted him. He was not an easy person personally, evidently. Crotchety and obsessed with the idea of genocide. It was due to that he was able to do what he did, but it was also due to that obsession that he turned people away who otherwise sympathized with him and sympathized with his ideas. But his health suffered from this cumulative stress. When he died suddenly on a street in New York City in 1959. He was living then in a rented room in Manhattan. His funeral, which had 7 people in attendance, had to be paid for itself by the American Jewish Committee. He was alone and obscure. That obscurity of this unsung hero was fully in evidence at the end of his life. So, exactly what is it, as we examine it now, that makes the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide so important? There are, I believe, 4 key issues at stake in it. The first is the fact that before 1948, international law had little to say about actions a government might take within its own boundaries, within the scope of its own power. Internally, governments could freely do as they chose, whether to their own citizens or to non-citizen minorities, anyone under their rule. Such decisions were viewed internationally as private matters of state, no matter what type of government the state had or how that government had come to power. The second step taken in the convention was directed against the so-called fog of war argument. Fog of war as an expression of art. The common claim that in wartime, uncontrollable events happen, events for which finally nobody can be held accountable. This argument had often been used to justify the persecution of groups of people within warring countries or in conquered territories. The Geneva Conventions, dating back to the 19th century, provided some protection for prisoners of war or other combatants, and even for certain non-combatants, but nothing for civilian minority groups. A third consideration was the issue of where responsibility lay for crimes committed by a national government. The claim had usually been accepted that only a ruling group or individual, a ruler in the government, was responsible for such actions. Subordinates, those underneath the ruling group, could and did typically claim that they were only following orders. One understands that, subordinates. For Lemkin, however, where genocide was concerned, all that rationalization must be rejected. The machinery of genocide, he held, was too complex to be ascribed only to a few or to somebody at the top, a single person at the top. The fourth and most basic premise in Lemkin's articulation of the crime of genocide was the importance he attached to the existence of groups, the rights of groups to their own cultures. Still more basically, the right to that is the group's life, that groups had a right to life. It was on this principle that group murder, group killing, becomes a crime directly parallel to the crime of individual murder. More traditionally, human rights were conceived as individual rights, rights belonging to individual persons by nature, innately. And individuals are born individuals. So, for example, the so-called unalienable rights of the U.S. Declaration of Independence to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Genocide, by contrast, affirmed the existence of a parallel group right to existence, a right of the groups to exist and to be sustained in that existence. It's a very big jump. Lemkin himself wasn't entirely responsible for conceptualizing the notion of group rights, but the concept of genocide is very important, a crucial step in the development of that concept, which has become much more significant in legal and moral analyses since this. So let's look more at the document then, which you have in front of you, at the way in which the UN Convention there is a term of art for the legislation. Let's look at the way in which the UN Convention summarizes these matters. Look, for example, at Article 1. Article 1 boldly asserts that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, is a crime under international law. Now, there's two sides of that statement. I mean, notice that why does it mention peace and war? Because those are special instances where genocide may occur. A government might, in time of peace, internally persecute its own minority groups. It can't then claim it's doing this under the pressure of war. They can claim something like civil war, but it's internal to it within the country. The country's at peace in relation to others. But this would be international legislation that would apply in that case. And that was the instance, for example, in the Armenian, the Turks with respect to the Armenians. They were persecuting the Armenians within the bounds of Turkey, not beyond that. And also it covered the instances where a government might claim that in wartime the war was justification for the persecution of groups outside the country during that, or even internally as well, but also groups outside the country. War provides no cover or excuse for genocide, and neither does peacetime, when a government decides for reasons of its own to persecute its own minorities. Article 2 then, if you go down. Now, there are two crucial questions that Article 2 addresses. The first well, there are three really. So, number one has to define which groups. In a way, it's a it's a ghoulish question. Which groups are eligible for genocide? We talk about many kinds of groups. After all, if one talks about groups, there are basketball teams, bridge clubs, college sophomores, people over 40, people under 40. They all constitute groups. So which groups would be eligible for genocide or come under the protection of this convention? That was a debated question at the UN as they drafted this. And they settle, if you look at Article 2, notice the groups that are identified there. National, ethnical, we don't use ethnical now, ethnic, racial, or religious group. 4 groups were identified by the UN Convention as eligible for, that's, it's an awkward term, but one doesn't think of others that this would be applicable to them. Now, why those groups? Well, in the reasoning, and we have records of the minutes of discussions at the UN during this time, they were seen to be central for the for group identification, religious, national, ethnic, and racial. Now, all of those categories have been under pressure of various kinds. They were also, or they are also commonly seen as group identity, features of group identity into which individuals are born, racial, religious. Now, of course, there are opportunities for racial conversion and so on, but, and also now the concept of race itself has come under great pressure conceptually, I mean, as to how many races there are, how does one identify them, and so on. But we're talking about a document at the time which identified categories that had been significant in determining individual and group identities. There's no stipulation here that those are the only groups that can be, to which genocide can be applied, although under the convention, those were the 4 identified. So it could be amended. And at the time, there was a struggle, for example, whether political groups or economic groups, those were the 2 major omissions that were disputed at the time. Economic groups, classes, or political groups, parties, whether they should be included here as having the concept of genocide applicable to them as well. They were excluded. Political groups were excluded on political grounds. I mean, people, especially within the Soviet bloc at that time, they didn't, they vetoed, in effect, the inclusion of political groups as one of them. And the convention has been criticized since its adoption for not including other groups. There may be other groups as well, but there's nothing in the convention which prevents amendment, although that hasn't in fact happened. Still with Article 2, and here we come to a significant and intriguing part of the concept of genocide. Notice the way in which it's defined in A, B, C, D. Killing members of the group. Well, a group can be destroyed by killing, physical killing, but it doesn't necessarily involve that. And you see then, if you look down at D and E, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Now, a system of mass sterilization applied to a group, what would happen to the group after that? I mean, after a generation, if it's really a thorough sterilization, the group would disappear. That counts as genocide as well. And incidentally, I mean, Nazi Germany initiated a program of sterilization which never reached the proportions that the extermination camps did. It preceded that. And in fact, I mean, historically, the use of gas, of Zyklon B, the use of poison gas in the camps, in the death camps, was preceded by the use of poison gas, among other means, within Germany itself for extermination, but also there was a program of sterilization that was applied for eugenic purposes, so-called, within Germany itself. Well, Part E there, notice again, forcibly transferring children of one group to another. In other words, the kidnapping of children from their parents and replacing them, not killing them, but moving them elsewhere to another culture, the majority culture, so that their past is obliterated and then they become assimilated to the group into which they, in that case also, the initial group into which they're born would disappear if it were done systematically on a mass scale. Now, that's important because it points directly to the conceptualization of genocide, that it's the extermination of the group. The group disappears by those means. It's not only physical killing. One last feature of Article 2, if you look at the opening statement, any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy. Now, that's intent. The intention has to be clear. That's a distinction, and a crucial distinction, between genocide and homicide. When we speak of attempted murder, that's treated differently from murder. I mean, attempted murder doesn't have to succeed, and it's still a crime, but we distinguish that crime from murder itself. With genocide, genocide doesn't have to succeed, if one can use that term for it. In other words, the total populace or the total group doesn't have to be exterminated in order for the term genocide, the charge of genocide, to be applicable. There has to be evidence. How does one determine the intent to commit genocide? Well, there again, one can turn to the Nazi genocide for evidence. I mean, it was clear from statements like the one that I cited by Himmler about the design of the Nazi, that was the intention, and by their actions. You know, the death factories. They weren't just concentration camps. There are 6 death camps, which were in effect factories of death. They weren't labor camps. They were meant to kill, murder. People would come in, and in the same day, the trains would arrive, and the crematoria would be working on them by the end of that day. They were factories, death factories. So with that, I mean, now it's always difficult to define or to meet the criteria of what an intention is. That's at a personal level and it's at a group level. But all right, I mean, one has to take the evidence as it comes. So that's an important distinction here between genocide as a form of murder and individual murder or massacres of individuals. The intention to do it based on the evidence is sufficient to warrant the charge of genocide. In point of fact, I mean, I pointed this out in yesterday's discussion here at Duke, that, you know, in one sense, the Nazi genocide didn't succeed. I mean, the Jews as a people survived, notwithstanding Himmler's statement to make them disappear from the earth. They didn't. On the other hand, there's also no question that the Nazi genocide was indeed a genocide. I mean, the intent was certainly clear here. So then, if you would move to Article 4, persons committing genocide or any of the other acts enumerated in Article 3 shall be punished, and here the crucial clause, whether they are constitutionally responsible rulers, public officials, or private individuals. Now, I made that point earlier in my comments, that there was no exemption. It wasn't a sense that only those initiating the process of genocide should be held responsible. But private individuals, that covers a lot of ground. That is, contributors to the act of genocide, collaborators with it, become responsible. Now, in point of fact, in any mass, killing, or group killing of the sort that genocide applies to, the question always arises, what level of responsibility can be ascribed to individuals? I mean, for example, in the death camps in the Nazi death camps, I mean, the people who were killed were brought there by train. So the engineers of the train, would they have been charged as collaborators or responsible for what they were doing? They were bringing prisoners. They knew that they knew the conditions under which the prisoners were being kept and transported, and they also knew the way in which what they were being transported to. So, I mean, there are levels of collaboration here, and I mean, perhaps we can talk about that subsequently in the discussion, but those are difficult questions, you know, and there's no formula, there's no algorithm, I think, that can settle the question of where responsibility begins or ends and so on. Well, there are other matters taken up in the convention, and we could discuss those as you wish. You can see that the convention as a whole is remarkably brief. It's just we have everything here in the 19 articles of the convention. Furthermore, since the time of its adoption in 1948, the convention has not been amended or changed. That status quo has been due partly to the difficulty of winning agreement on changes that might be made, but it's also due to the force of the convention itself, its legal and moral importance, and the way in which the original formulation has become an integral part of the world's cultural understanding. Very few documents of any sort in our past have equaled that impact. Few have been so quickly and fully absorbed into our collective social and moral conscience as has this one. It's true that the aim of the Genocide Convention, as stated in its title, was also the prevention of genocide, and clearly instances of genocide have occurred since the convention was passed in the General Assembly. But we know from our own experience and historical experience that violations of all laws occur commonly, beginning, we have to admit, with the Ten Commandments. I mean, but that's not seen as a reason for rejecting those laws or for rejecting the Ten Commandments. There may be other reasons, but not the fact that they've been violated. That the Genocide Convention has been sustained for almost 70 years attests itself to its significance. It remains a monument, this convention which you have in your hands, remains a monument, a living memorial to the person most directly responsible for it, Raphael Lemkin, the now, I hope, not so unsung hero whom we've been discussing. Thank you. So I'd be glad, I mean, we can go over the convention itself or other aspects. Yes?
I didn't read this all the way, but could somebody...
You'll have to speak up, I'm sorry.
just make it quick. Could there be a genocide because of a lack of a group?
Well, there the distinction comes between genocide and mass murder. There are mass murders, I mean, where individuals are simply singled out. I mean, we've seen some of them. Take 9/11. All the people, I mean, the effort was made to destroy the World Trade Towers. And it succeeded, I mean, in killing a lot of them. Was that genocide? And I think the answer to that has to be no. It was terrible. It's an atrocity. And 2,000 people lost their lives. So it's mass murder. That, yes. But that's, look, start with a simpler example. What's the difference between first-degree murder and manslaughter? In one way, there isn't a difference. Somebody is killed in both instances, right? Manslaughter means that somebody has been killed. But the difference there is in the intention. First-degree murder presumes that the intent is there. Somebody knew that what they were doing and they did it deliberately. Manslaughter can be accidentally killing somebody for which one is still responsible without intention. So that's an important distinction, even though the outcome in that case is identical. In the case, and that holds true for large group killings like 9/11. I mean, whatever the perpetrators of that had in mind. And it's not as if, I mean, perhaps they really would have wanted to kill millions. I mean, undoubtedly, had they been asked what they wanted to do eventually, very probably they would have said that. And perhaps they would have wanted to say a group, but in fact they picked randomly. All they wanted to do was to kill a lot of people, and they succeeded in that. So it's a massacre, mass murder, but not genocide. And that, I mean, look, genocide has come to be used as a synonym for atrocity in general. You know, I mean, it's used very loosely, which is too bad. I mean, there are a lot of terrible things that happen, terrible acts which are committed, which are not genocide. You know, and just as, again, the distinction between manslaughter and first-degree murder, it's a significant distinction. And the difference between genocide and mass murder is also significant, for reasons which I've tried to, I mean, at least that's the way in which I would argue it and what I would hope to be. Yeah, Margaret.
Sort of in that same vein, is there any documented or documentation as to why other groups that Hitler specifically targeted weren't included, such as homosexuals or mentally challenged or cripples, for that matter?
Well, yes, I mean, there's a big literature about that, and that's an instance where other groups are sometimes, see, again, where genocide is used loosely and it loses its distinctive force. Now, there were laws against homosexuality preceding the Nazis, which were retained under the Nazis, and male homosexuals, not female, not lesbians, were subsumed under that for other reasons. I mean, but the number of people who are actually, I mean, then the question came, well, was the intention genocidal? Now, nobody should lose their lives because of that. I mean, so it's an atrocity, it's murder, but it's not genocide. I mean, because the number of homosexuals who actually died as a consequence of Nazi actions against them was, compared to the number within Germany, I mean, of Germans, not of Jews, was relatively small. The number is usually set at about 10,000. Now, 10,000 murders is 10,000 murders. That's not a small number, but it's not genocide. And the same holds true with respect to the Roma, you know, the so-called gypsies. There was persecution of the Roma, but there were groups that were exempted from that. So that, look, the issue of whether something is genocide, there are many cases where it's debatable, but there are other instances where it's quite clear. It's quite clear. In Rwanda, there was no question about that, or no significant question. And certainly in Germany, there was, in relation to the Jews, there was no significant question. Let's see, yes?
Yes, hi, I'm just related to this question. For instance, Article 2B, I'm wondering if these conventions could be applied to the persecution of gays in general and not allowing them to get to marry. And could these be applied to, let's just say, the Pope or other political leaders, quote unquote, who would pass laws against letting them marry or adopt children or indeed killing them?
Well, conceivably, but I mean, as we know, I mean, forbidding marriage doesn't prevent reproduction, you know, in itself. I mean, isn't that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, but I think the point you're making, look, there could be prohibitions against group identity based on other factors than those indicated here. I mean, one of the stories told about in Cambodia, I mean, Pol Pot was the attempt to annihilate the class of intellectuals. Now, how does one identify intellectual? You know, because it was supposedly a peasant uprising or domination, you know, a revolution. So people who wore eyeglasses were suspect. I mean, because it meant, you know, wearing eyeglasses identify intellectuals? No, of course not. I mean, but in a society, you know, if it's taken as a marker, that would be arbitrary. But it's no more arbitrary than some other identifying mark. So everyone with eyeglasses should be, you know, exterminated. That's a group, people wearing eyeglasses. You know, it wouldn't. Let's see, all the way back. Yes.
Is there a amount of people that it requires for something to be considered genocide, or is it any one group of people?
Well, that's a good question. And as you see in the convention itself, it doesn't require a minimum number. I mean, one could say, well, suppose there's a group which, just by attrition, you know, people leave, or disease. It comes down to one person, the last of the Mohegans. I mean, in principle, yes. So, killing the last member, one member, you know, even though there would be no chance of the person so it would satisfy that. But, you know, at that point we're talking casuistry, you know, even though that would be the case in principle, to be consistent. But the issue of genocide, when it's understood to be the murder of a group, would obviously be intended to apply in cases where there are larger groups. But you're quite right. To be consistent, there is no, and in that sense, there may be, and there have been massacres or mass murders in which more people were killed than in a genocide. I mean, that was undoubtedly the case in the instance of the German genocide, one of the first genocides of the 20th century in South Africa, of the Hereros. I mean, it wasn't a very large population, but they were concentrated in a particular area, and the effort was made to exterminate them. It wasn't a large group by, you know, by contemporary standard, by the number of people who were killed, but certainly more than one. Let's see. Yeah, please.
I just wondered if you could say something about why it took 40 years for the U.S. Senate to...
Well, you could probably answer your own question. I mean, look, governments typically, and certainly the United States among them, is very jealous of its own sovereignty. It didn't want to be subject to international law, the possibility that it could be prosecuted for crimes. Look, one development which comes out of this convention is the formation of the International Criminal Court, which now sits in The Hague and which undertakes one of the charges to the International Criminal Court. It's independent of the United Nations, but it's prescribed here. I mean, the stipulation is made here in this convention that there should be a means of punishing. Remember, the title is the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The United States has still not agreed to be subject to the authority of the International Criminal Court, even now, today. It's our government. I mean, and there's some sense, or it's been mooted that perhaps a new president of the United States, depending on who it is, may in fact encourage the agreement to sign on to the state. Look, you know, it's interesting in the case of the Genocide Convention. After all, something like 140 countries of the world are now signatories of that. And the United States eventually did in 1988, but it had come before the Senate a number of times and been turned away. And finally it did, although even when it was done with severe reservations, which almost, I mean, the stipulation that subject to the agreement of the United States, that it could be prosecuted only if we agreed to be prosecuted. Well, that takes the teeth out of it, doesn't it? I mean, let's see. Yes, please.
So Article 2, Section E, it says forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So the Ottomans, they used children to form their janissaries. Would that be considered genocide?
Say the last.
So the Ottomans, they forcibly took children from other countries and they used them to essentially create their janissaries, which were their elites.
Well, if the intent there is to eliminate the group from which the children were taken, and not just to get additional, members of their own, then that wouldn't be. But if it's an attempt to exterminate the group, to bring that group identity to an end, then it would be. That would be the dividing line, which would be difficult at times to determine, but that's the line there.
How many times has this convention been invoked since it went into effect?
Well, that's a good question. Who invokes it? The United Nations sometimes does, sometimes not. Look, there was a case in the United States when Clinton, Bill Clinton was president about Bosnia. He waffled for years over whether what happened in Bosnia should be identified as a genocide. Partly because if it is identified as genocide, then various other measures kick in. So, and then the question that you're asking, who does the identifying, who does the naming or legislation? I mean, the UN can, but and there the General Assembly, is it the General Assembly or the Security Council? The Security Council has is a much more forceful body than the General Assembly. So the question itself lends itself to vagary. Who identifies?
So shouldn't that have been written into the convention so that it would have been clear who has the...
Yes, well, it was on those grounds that the convention does include the provision encouraging, it can't require the formation of an international court. Now, the International Criminal Court can do that, and it has the teeth, and it has done that, so that the term genocide is one of the charges that has been brought against some of the individuals who have been brought to trial under the rule, the authority of the International Criminal Court. Now there is a way, an official way of counting in that sense.
Up here? Yeah.
I apologize, I came in late. I'm wondering, you spoke to the concept of ethnic conversion. Could you explain that? Because I thought ethnicity was set in stone.
Well, yes and no. I mean, people move from one culture to another. It's what we mean by acculturation, isn't it? Often that can be a voluntary, and certainly over generations. I mean, most of us here have, in our ancestry, people who came from elsewhere. Other countries, other ethnic groups. We don't, and we become assimilated. So, in that sense, ethnicity is not set in stone, is it? I mean, if one deliberately sets out to assimilate, to acculturate into another, one can do that, usually. I mean, unless there's resistance on the part of the culture, that doesn't want to admit outsiders in. So, look, that's an issue for all of the 4 groups that are identified here. Nationality is simple. I mean, nationality, all Americans. Well, somebody comes from Ecuador or Thailand, they become Americans. I mean, so yeah, that's a nationality. One can easily change that identity. I mean, that's certainly, cultural may be more difficult, ethnicity more difficult, but still, religious also, and even racially, you know, I mean, the concept of race, you know, is so ambiguous now, biologically anyway. Biologically, the concept of race is, you know, it's not a matter of people choosing, it's a matter of what sense can be made of the concept, criteria. How many races are there? Well, anyway, if the range of numbers by biologists, you know, who look in is extraordinary. I mean, you know, we all at one time or another have filled out questionnaires of how we wish to identify, self-identify. And there are a number, I mean, the numbers there fluctuate as well. And there's always that category other. I mean, a very handy category when all the others are listed.
Julie?
I'm struck by two tensions in the concept of genocide. On the one hand, the newness of the concept, and yet on the other hand, Lemkin's attention to placing it in a very long history. And on the other hand, it's a concept that opens, it's based on the Holocaust experience, and yet it's one that opens out to linking that, the Holocaust with other similar genocides. I can't find another word. So I was wondering if you would comment on those tensions, either with respect to Lemkin or to the later debates about the uniqueness of the Holocaust and how they've handled this.
Okay, those are, they're related questions. Look, Lemkin himself was extremely conscious of the fact that his own experience in World War II, the loss of his family members, because he was attached to them, I mean, more than just as normally anyone would be, at least as much, made it suspicious for other people. He didn't want to be stereotyped as arguing for the convention, the Genocide Convention, on the basis of the Holocaust. It wasn't a Holocaust convention. It was a genocide. He was very careful to distinguish. He was talking, and that led him to investigate the historical occurrences of genocide, that it had happened. And in fact, I mean, he was probably, arguably, too generous in including genocides that didn't even fit his own definition. He wanted it to be understood as a general concept, not about the Holocaust, not about that. And it was only due to that when in 1948, he was able to get Saudi Arabia, Jordan, to sign the Genocide Convention, and Israel, which was a newly founded state. So he was trying very hard. I mean, obviously the Holocaust had a different impact and import for Israel than it did for other countries of the world. I mean, and it had something to do, arguably, with the establishment, the independence of Israel and so on, but we don't have, he wanted to neutralize that, so he was very careful. In other words, he was bending over backwards, not to have it, genocide, identified as a monument to the Holocaust. And indeed, I mean, the effect of it since then, of course, is the applicability elsewhere. Now, does that affect the uniqueness of the claim of uniqueness for the Holocaust? We spoke about that to some extent in yesterday's session. But I mean, uniqueness is a difficult, a predicate to apply wherever it is applied. I mean, it's all, for something to be unique, it has to be unique in respect to certain properties. And many of the groups that have experienced what they take to be genocide think of or speak of that as unique. I mean, the Armenians have a particular term for their, the Aged, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, A-G-H-A-D, And the predicate uniqueness is applied to that. I mean, the Palestinians, the Nakba, also the expulsion regarded by the Palestinians as an instance of genocide. I don't know what more to say. I don't think, in my own understanding or analysis of the Holocaust, I don't find anything is added to it by speaking of it as unique. Certainly the conditions were distinctive. I mean, it was, better organized, more systematic than many of the genocides and so on, and spread over a wider area. But one can talk about that without talking about uniqueness. I mean, that's the mechanism, the way in which it was carried out. But, I mean, I think one could have an argument about it. I don't think that the category of genocide, it's meant to speak of a phenomenon which has been common, recurrent, and which is unfortunately likely to be with us for some time, notwithstanding the legislation and so on.
Picking first-time questioners there.
In my high school class on the Holocaust, we focused in on slavery versus the Holocaust, not to pit them against each other. But would slavery be considered genocide? I mean, like the stuff that Martin too, it doesn't seem like it, but is it fair to compare the two like that?
Well, let me just say more generally, there are instances of cruelty, oppression, and the issue of whether they should count as genocidal or not may be difficult. And there are obviously gray zones, borderline cases. Lemkin himself wanted to talk about cultural genocide. He wanted a separate category for that. He didn't succeed in getting that before the UN, although the notion of an ethnic group comes close to that as eligible as having genocide applicable to that. The question would be whether in slavery the attempt is made to eliminate the culture of the people enslaved as well as to enslave them. And that would depend on the conditions. Now, certainly, if one's speaking about American slavery, there's a kind of naivete on the part of the slave owners who believed or thought in terms of that there was no culture to be destroyed. I mean, they didn't even grant that much. Well, in a way, that it allowed and there was a culture among the slaves before they came, and even in terms of these period of slavery. So I don't have an answer for that. It's certainly a candidate for it, but in that gray zone between yes and no, I don't have and I'm not an authority on what counts as genocidal or not. I mean, this has been rather a formal conceptualization of genocide. I'm sure that, look, and those are hard cases. I mean, there are hard cases for anybody. I mean, the idea of a gray zone that's why it's a gray zone.
One more question back there.
Is there some kind of stipulation that after the convention, the bodies within that couldn't retroactively investigate events in the past that could be defined as genocide? Does that make sense?
Well, as you know, retroactive laws are suspect as laws. I mean, one can't, and in fact, it's a feature of legislation that ordinarily laws are passed only after the fact. In other words, there are laws. One way of looking at the practices, the conduct of a society, is to see the laws or prohibitions which are established, because then one knows what was going on arguing backwards. But one can't, I mean, one can't prosecute ordinarily on the basis of retroactive legislation.
Well, our time is up. And so I thank you, Professor Wang.